Today on the Perception and Action podcast, a preview of my newly released book, How We Learn to Move, a revolution in the way we coach and practice sports skills. So it's time for a call to action. Hello, and thanks for joining me. This is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. If you're a coach or an instructor, my goal is to help you bridge the gap between research and application, and to connect your experiential knowledge with skill acquisition and motor learning theory. I want to help take you from using practice design recipes to becoming a master chef who can manipulate the key ingredients to come up with your own innovative training methods. If you're a student or fellow academic working in the skill acquisition field, I hope to keep you up to date on the latest studies and help you get to know the people working in this area. Finally, if you're developing training technologies, I hope to help you incorporate good motor learning principles in your design, pull out key performance metrics from the data, and design effective studies to evaluate your product. To learn more, help support the podcast, and or work directly with me, please check out perceptionaction.com. Now on to the show. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception Action podcast. I'm very excited to announce that my book is here. So for those of you that are regular listeners, you know I've been alluding to this for a while. I've been working on a book on skill acquisition. It's called How We Learn to Move, a revolution in the way we coach and practice sports skills. Well, I'm happy to say the book is, when you're hearing this, the book is now available. The easiest way to find it is on Amazon. There's an ebook and a paperback version. You can also go to perceptionaction.com/book, where you'll find a bit more information about it and also the links to order. So what I want to do in this presentation is to go through a little bit of a preview of the book and talk about some of my motivations for writing it. And I would really be honored if you consider buying it and reading it and give me some feedback. I'm kind of happy. I'm happy with the way it turned out, and it's something I think about doing for a while. So, and I think if you're a listener to my material, I think you will enjoy it because you'll see it's obviously a lot of similarities there. So why did I write this book now? Well, really two motivations. One is I wanted to give kind of people a launching point for the ecological approach, ecological dynamics in coaching, sports skills mostly, but also other movement skills. You know, I get lost a lot about resources. You know, what books should I read? You know, what papers should I read? And a lot of cases, it's people, I've heard about this topic of constraints or self-organization or ecological dynamics, and where should I start? And I always felt, there's some great books out there, Button and all's Dynamics of Skill Acquisition, for example, that are great resources. But I always found that, they're very in-depth and they go through high level, a lot of concepts, and, it's quite involved in reading those. And I always wanted, was looking for something that's gets you to the logic of the ecological approach, talks about some of the key concepts, some of the key research people, without going into all the elaborate detail of it. So kind of give you a starting point to launch to. And so that's one of the things I was trying to achieve, kind of more of a general audience book, maybe, about the ecological approach. And the second thing I wanted to try to do was to bring in all the different aspects, right? Most of the books in this area are focused specifically on practice design or on coaching kids for physical education. What I wanted to try to do in this book is bring in the whole picture, right? Because I know I've emphasized in the podcast, I think this approach has far reaching beyond just practice design. Obviously, there's a ton in there on practice design, but also injury prevention, youth coaching has been talked in other books, technology development, using analytics for sports, and so on. So I wanted to bring that all together and try to show how I think it fits all together in this big picture of this ecological approach, right? So that's really what I was trying to achieve with this book, to kind of be, so I think both if you're brand new to this idea of this different way of coaching, this revolution, as I'm calling it, And I think if you're heavily involved in it, I'm hoping you'll find it useful as well as a resource to kind of capture some of the main ideas and things that I love along that line. So that's what I was trying to achieve. So let me go through a little bit of kind of what's in the book in terms of I'll go through chapter by chapter and talk about some of the things you expect to find. And coming up, I'm going to make quite a few resources available for this book. I'm going to do some short videos showing some of the key concepts from each of the chapters. So I start off by, of course, talking about I call it the myth of the one correct repeatable technique, right? So the foundation on which the ecological approach is built is I'm calling it the anti-repetition revolution, right? The idea, moving away from the idea that we become skillful, which is, as I show in the chapter, is a very, very strong held idea. There's tons of quotes people have about the importance of repetition and having the correct technique. And of course, bringing in the ideas of Bernstein and other people about moving away from this idea, the repetition without repetition revolution. So trying to dispel the myth that that's the way we become skillful, right? So that's the place that I start, pulling in all the pieces for that and trying to show you that that's the wrong way to think about things. Then I try to go on to talk about the fact that one of the reasons that's incorrect is our body is not designed to do one thing over and over. We're built to both produce and detect variation, right? So I give examples of how your body is meant to be variable, right? And I give examples of, your heart rate, your eye movements, a whole bunch of different examples of how variability is really a key feature of your body. And then I try to go into the explanations of why that is the case. This figure showing here, the idea of stochastic resonance, the idea of degeneracy, right? So in the book, I try to explain the key concepts. I don't go into all the high-level terminology. I try to, there's some of that, but I try to use it kind of sparingly just to get to the main key ideas about this, right? So we were built to produce and detect, to talk about, how your sensory systems are really, they're designed to detect things changing, varying, not staying the same. Right, so that's kind of the subject. So I'm kind of, in this book, I try to kind of build a story through the chapters. That's the way I kind of wrote it. Instead of researching tons of articles and things, I kind of tried to write it kind of free form, where I just kind of flowed from one idea to the next, right? So that's kind of where I go. The next is I get into what I call the business of producing movements. So I get into the analogy of movement production, perception action as a business, right? And contrasting the traditional hierarchical top-down central executive model versus self-organization, and trying to convince you why you don't need a boss. And I try to contrast the two. I try to show you the advantages of the two different approaches, disadvantages. And also in this chapter, I try to get into kind of how the business model of motor learning, the traditional business model, has spun off into tons of training technologies and training methods, right? Without almost our awareness of this has kind of been lost, right? That we're really have this assumption of how things are being done that may be flawed, right? And so I kind of challenge some of the training methods and some of the training technologies, right? And really getting into what exactly is self-organization in this chapter. Then I get into the idea of course constraints, right? If we're going to self-organize, and I bring in the idea that, if variability is good and we want to be able to move in different ways, I bring in, of course, the degrees of freedom problem. How do we decide how to move, right? Well, we talk about the problem, the inherent problem people have of choice, right? Human beings are not good with lots of choice. How do we do this? And I show the kind of paradoxical, the idea that constraining gives you freedom, right? I talk about the idea of constraints, giving some different ideas of task constraints, cultural constraints, and I try to get into what different functions of constraints are, right? And show some specific examples, right? And I get into this in more detail later on, but I just want to give a kind of a general introduction of what constraints are. Then I get into something that you don't always see connected with this ecological dynamics, right? Loosely, but I don't think people have always gotten into full detail about this, getting into embodied perception and affordances, right? So not only do like I say in the book, not only do we have a revolution in how we think we produce movements and become skillful, right? In terms of variability and self-organization, there's also a revolution in terms of what we think our perceptual system is trying to do, right? And how we perceive the world. We don't perceive the world in terms of the physical properties that are out there. We see the world in terms of affordances and embodied, how we scale it from our action capacities and things like that. So I try to tie that into the ideas of movement, self-organization and so on. And this, of course, I bring in, of course, the other central figure in this revolution, I'm calling it James Gibson, and talk about his work and his ideas. I then try to bring in the dynamic side of it, right? Talk about, some of Newell's work and Kelso's work on the idea that learning is search, right? And really I tried to keep a fairly high level discussion of attractors, right? And what an attractor is, the idea of intrinsic dynamics, the idea that we have to build on top of what each of us has. And I try to relate this to some specific examples, like as his title suggests, Tim Tebow. So trying to talk about the dynamics, the idea of attraction, these things in terms of how we learn, bifurcation, right? All these kind of concepts on a fairly high level way. Again, linking it to the problem of that I set out before. We want to produce movements in different ways. How do we constrain the problem? How do we find solutions? Right. So that's what you'll find in that chapter. Then in the next two chapters, I get in very specifics on the new kind of ways of coaching in the ecological dynamics approach. And first of all, I talk about the constraints-led approach, talking about what the goals of constraints are, what's the purpose of a constraints manipulation, and giving examples, illustrating the key concepts and why we constrain and how we should be constraining and what should we be looking for, right? So the constraints-led approach. Then I get on to differential learning, talking about the ideas of that. In both of these, I summarize the research and try to talk about all the studies that I've found that have compared and contrasted them, and try to bring that in, show you the benefits, right? To show you why we do these things instead of trying to explicitly tell you how to change your technique, right? And I show you some examples, the problems with explicit instructions about technique. I bring all that in and talk about these different ways of doing things. So those two chapters. Then I get in kind of to the challenging issue of, if we're going to let people search and explore, exploring is a very dominant idea across this whole book. And I talk about if we're going to let people out there and searching and explore for movement solutions, how do we know we're setting them on the right path, right? How do we know we're leading them into a fruitful field of vegetables and fruits and not off a cliff, right? If we're letting them explore. So I talk about what a good solution is, what an optimality is, and how we can, coach to know whether an athlete is effectively self-organizing. So getting into some of those issues. Then I get into kind of some of the things that I think are important to talk about that are related, that are, only sometimes pulled in, talking about what it means to be creative, right? A new view, of creativity as exploration, interaction with the environment side of things. Talking about some of the stuff you may have already heard, but then getting into some other examples and really emphasizing how do we get people to be creative, right? What are the methods that we can use to do that and how it connects with the other ideas? Then I get into the idea of the youth coaching, right? I start the book, as you'll see in the very thing, with kind of lamenting how we've coached kids and the kind of the problems I see with it that a lot of other people have expressed as well. I just kind of highlighting them and summarizing them, and how we can change, how we can do things differently. What are the limitations with the way we're doing things and how we can do things differently. The idea of fundamental movement skills, we'll get into that in there and talk about this as well. Then I kind of get into the next chapter. I get into, how this totally changes our view of what it means to learn, right? Moving away from this asymmetrical idea that we acquire things, and really kind of two of the things. So what I'm trying to shoot down in this book, or challenge at the very least, is there's two kind of dominant ideas in motor learning that come from a long time. One is repetition. You learn by repeating. The other is automaticity. We get skillful by removing ourselves from the environment, by becoming reflexive, habitual, right? We want to be like a soldier. We want to have it drilled into us so it comes out automatically. So I'm trying to challenge these ideas and really get it through the idea of direct learning and what we actually happens when we become an expert. And I give lots of examples of things, examples of education of attention. What do we mean by that? What is it? And so on. Then in the last few chapters, I tried to get into some more practical implications. In chapter 13, I talk about what I think is the evolving role of technology and data, right? Moving away from the traditional way we use these things to correct technique or put in the ideal form or overloading an athlete with data, to talk about what I think are better ways of using these things to support self-organization, variability, so on. And I really emphasize the message that I give in this chapter is the important role for the coach. The coach needs to be between the data and the athlete, right? And I really kind of stress that throughout things. Then in 14, I get into injury prevention and adaptation, what happens when you do get injured, talking about evidence of how you can design practice to actually decrease the chance an athlete will get injured. Pulling in some of these principles, this is where, representativeness, coupling, all these kind of ideas. And I cite evidence to show that there is growing body of evidence that following this kind of variability, anti-repetition revolution not only makes you more skillful, but it decreases the chance you're going to get injured, which I think is a really, really important effect. And then the very last chapter, I try to do a couple things. One is I try to talk about how I got where I am. I talk about, the expression I've used sometimes is I self-organize to self-organization. So I talk about some of my own just kind of experience with this and why I have come to kind of the ecological approach, ecological dynamics and my own kind of thinking, and do that on some of the problems that I see. And then I think one of the things that I tried to do, and this is just a little example, is I created infographics like I've been doing for all these topics. And I tried to pull out some basic resources for people. As I mentioned, I want this book to kind of be a launching pad. So in this book, I pulled out resources that I think, if you want to go further, right? So I've tried to pull out things you can listen to, things you can watch, and things you can read that are the next kind of, next places to go, next places to explore if you want to learn more about these specific topics. Right, so that's it. That's kind of the in a nutshell. That's what this book is. How we learn to move. As I said, I'm happy with the way it turned out. If you've ever written before, you probably experienced the same thing. You go from loving it to hating it to loving it to hating it during the process, and then by the end, you're not quite sure what you feel about it. But I'm hoping people find it resourceful. I hope it, if you're new to this area, it maybe changes the way you think about what it means to be skillful. If you're already in this, maybe, you have other coaches you work with and you want to kind of get them thinking in that direction. I hope this is a good resource. And then if you're really steeped in this area, I just hope, you'll find it enjoyable, the discussion and pulling in, as I said, I try to be a bit pulling in more things that are not usually in some of the books you see in this area, all these different technology, a lot of the research, it's not a comprehensive research, but I try to pull in some key studies that I think are really important in this area. And then the exploration guide. So as I said, the book is now available on Amazon. I hope you can consider picking it up. I do have plans for a follow-up I'll tell you about sometimes in the future, but I just want to revel in the fact that this one is done for a little while. And so I hope you consider buying it and having a read. And thanks for joining me. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter @ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled. Gone straight away.